Good morning. I'm thankful to have the opportunity to be here and to speak with you and to share what I've studied. I hope that it's uplifting and that it's edifying to you. And I actually intended this study to be, I intend all my studies to be just that, but I especially intended this one to be something that I thought was in need for my congregation when I made the study is the idea of uplifting. Because I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about making a lesson about positivity. Because when you spend time, as I do in my job or at school at times, around people who are very negative, you can realize how draining that is, how draining on your mindset that can be, and how difficult that can be from time to time. And as I said at work, I deal with a lot of people who seem to be very, very beaten down by the world. Their attitude is one of, this is just the latest blow in a series of hits that will just continue to come. And I know that the world can do that, and I know it can do it to us as well as it can do to people who are out in the world. So I wanted to provide a message of encouragement to you all. And as I started to study this, I realized I wasn't really just studying about positivity. That was a little bit too shallow. The scope of my lesson began to evolve into a study about joy. And the Greek word for joy is chara. It means cheerfulness or delight. And in Galatians 5 and verse 22, the Bible tells us, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith. And God tells us that, joy is a fruit of the Spirit. And I did a study a short time ago about the wisdom from above and how wisdom from above is not a natural outgrowth of life. You don't just as you get older gain wisdom from above. You don't become a wise person who is attributed with godly traits. That's something that takes study and it takes time and it takes us to pursue after. And the joy of the Lord is in the same category. I think you can know that just based off if you've spent a very long time on the earth, or if you know anybody who has spent a long time on the earth. You don't just naturally gain joy as you grow older. You don't become a more joyful person as you become older without a pursuit after it, after studying God's word after it, after trying to grow closer to Him to be more like that. But it is a natural outgrowth of the Spirit. And so, therefore, we know that God calls us to be joyful people because we are supposed to have the fruits of the Spirit. We are supposed to display those fruits as we grow in our faith. And I think before we go on, I want to make a distinction between happiness and between joy. And I looked at several times that the word happy is used in the New Testament, and that word is already up there, makarios, which means well-off, fortunate, or blessed. And almost every time that Greek word is used in the New Testament that I found, it was translated as blessed and not happy. And so the word joy that we read in Scripture is actually more closely related to our idea of what happiness is today. We think of happiness as a emotion of, you're happy. And it's similar, but it's not the same. And I want to explain the difference between those two things, because happiness is just an emotion. That's all it is. If I ask 10 people in this room something that makes you happy, very likely I would get 10 different answers. I'll give you a great example that I know my in-laws will love. This is something that makes me happy. I enjoyed watching this game. And I can tell you that happiness is certainly just an emotion because yesterday I got to watch a very different result that did not make me as happy. Trivial things can make you happy. Big things can make you happy. Even sin can make people happy. There are people who indulge in sin, and that sin makes them happy. That's not something that joy will do. Joy, if you are in the pursuit of Spirit-led joy, sin is not something that will make you happy, because happiness is just an emotion. It comes, we can enjoy it, and it will go from time to time. And I thought that joy is just a really intense version of happiness. And I think let's consider that together. To do so, I want to go to a couple of different places with you, but I want to start in Psalms, and I want to read a couple of Psalms back to back. So we'll start off with Psalms 16 and verse 8. It says, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Therefore my heart is glad, and my glory rejoiceth. My flesh also shall rest in hope. He says, for thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. And I want to turn again with you to Psalms 118 and verse 24. It says, this is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it. And again in Psalms 30, verse 5 and verse 11, he says, for his anger endureth but for a moment. In his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. And then he says, in verse 11, he says, thou hast turned for me my mourning into dancing. Thou hast put off my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. Now, we don't definitively know the author of every single psalm, but two of these three are almost certain to have been David's. And Psalm 118 is often attributed to him as well. And I think that's a big clue that joy is not something that's emotion-based. It's not something about always how you feel. Especially when you look at David's life and then you look at his writings in Psalms. David had a difficult life at times. He went through a lot of things. He was almost killed multiple times by a king that he served faithfully, that he was a faithful and fervent servant of. And David's first wife was given to another man by that same king while he was on the run for his life. His first child with Bathsheba died. His son Amnon was killed by his other son Absalom. And because of his inaction in that situation with Amnon and with Tamar, Absalom tried to rise up and take his father's kingdom from him and was killed during the process. Now bear that in mind. Bear in mind the challenges and the difficulties and the heartbreak that David went through as we also consider another couple of passages and another person. Let's turn to John 15 and verse 11. Jesus, speaking here to his disciples, says, these things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full. And let's also turn to 1 John 1 and verse 1. It says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and our hands have handled of the word of life. For the life was manifested, and we have seen it, and bear witness, and show unto you that eternal life which was with the Father and was manifested unto us. That which we have seen and heard declare we unto you, that ye also may have fellowship with us, and truly our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And these things write we unto you, that your joy may be full. So this first passage is Jesus speaking directly to the disciples. He tells them about he wants his joy to remain in them, that their joy may be full. And then this second passage we read about John talking about the joy that we ought to have in fellowship with Jesus. You know, Jesus, he also had a very difficult life. He suffered disbelief by his own family and countrymen. His own people tried to kill him multiple times, and they eventually succeeded when they hung him on a cross. But before being put on that cross, he was betrayed by his friend Judas. Then he was taken to these sham trials where he was mocked, and where he was spit on, and where he was beaten, and where a scourge was laid on his back. And then he finally died, one of the more painful deaths that you're going to find throughout history. So, why does David talk about joy? Why does Jesus talk about his joy? Because joy is not based on worldly comfort. It's not based on status. It's not based on your situation. It's not based on your safety. It's based on a dependence on God. And I want to specifically look back with you at what Jesus said to the disciples in John 15 and verse 11, where he tells them, these things have I spoken unto you, that my joy might remain in you and that your joy might be full. Let's look at the context of this passage. This is during the feast of the Passover. Jesus has washed the disciples' feet, and his time on the cross is very near. He's spending a lot of time doing a lot of teaching with the disciples, things that they need to hear. And the main thrust of a couple of those lessons is dependence on God, how their reliance on God was critical, how their reliance on him was critical. And John 14, 1 through 3 says, let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And also in John 15, 1 through 5, he says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that beareth not fruit he taketh away, and every branch that beareth fruit he purgeth it, that it may bring forth more fruit. Now ye are clean through the word which I have spoken unto you. Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself, except it abide in the vine. No more can ye, except ye abide in me. I am the vine, ye are the branches. He that abideth in me, and I in him, the same bringeth forth much fruit, for without me ye can do nothing. When I was putting this lesson together, I did a lot of reading in the Psalms, and if you read the Psalms, it's impossible to miss the theme of David's dependence on God, how often he comes back to that again and again. He says things like, "You're my buckler, you're my high tower, you light my path." He returns again and again to this, and he credits his joy to God. He credits the health of his flesh to God. And Jesus does the same thing when he speaks to the disciples. He says that my joy might remain in you, and that your joy might be full, that their dependence on him was where they got their joy from. And Christ knew what was coming. He knew that the cross was looming in front of him. He very possibly knew the exact moment when it would come. And was Jesus happy on the cross? Was he going to be happy as he walked to those cross or to those trials? Were his disciples expected to smile as they watched their Lord be crucified? As they watched their Lord be pierced with a spear? Certainly not. But we can be sure that despite the sorrow and despite the suffering that Jesus went through on the cross, his joy remained undiminished because it didn't come from a temporal or from an earthly source. It came from God. And I want to talk a little bit about the nature of this joy, about three things that it produces, something I'm going to call the 3 T's. Stability, humility, and positivity. And that probably went over a little bit better with my Uncle Chris, who really enjoys a good pun. And I'm going to talk about them in that order. So the first is stability. And this is because of the source of joy. Joy comes from a dependence on and a hope in God, which makes it stable. Any other source that we could think to put our joy in, put our hope in, is something that won't produce joy because it's not as stable, it's not as constant. A strong man can be brought down by sickness. A rich man can easily lose his wealth over a couple of weeks or a couple of bad financial investments. Even a man who tries to derive his joy from raising his children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord will be disappointed because your children will fail. Even if they are good, strong Christian people who you raised correctly, they're going to fail because they're people too. So of all the things that we can try to place our joy in, whether it's in wealth or strength or family or entertainment, only God is stable. Only God is constant, because God has been here since before the beginning and he will continue to exist after the end. And so when he tells us in Hebrews 1:13 and verse 5, he says, "Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." There is great comfort in that. And we see David turned again and again to God during times of great instability in his life. He knew that God would be there. He knew that God was not going to disappear or fail him. We should learn from that example that we see David display, because there's great stability in the joy that comes from God, because it springs from the only thing in this universe that is truly constant. And our earthly lives are so short that there are many things that we can be deceived into thinking or feeling as though are constant. James 4 and verse 14 says, "Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away." We look around and we see things that have been here since before we were born, or since things that have been here as long as humans have been here. You know, the sun has shone on every single person who has ever lived, and so it's easy to think of the sun as a constant. But one day that sun is going to be snuffed out like a candle. God is the only thing that has been here through it all, that has reigned through it all. He hasn't just endured, he has reigned through it all. So we can trust in that constancy. Our joy can be stable because of that constancy. As tumultuous as life is, we have a rock that is sure to be stable, and that's God. And I want you to consider that for a moment. really think about how God provides stability for you and why. And as I was considering this, as I went over this in my mind, I thought about the humility that should be reflected in my life, how much I needed God. In the Psalms, David makes it plain that he is entirely reliant on God. We're dependent on God for everything. We're dependent on God for the very world that we live in. Hebrews 1 and verse 3 says, "Who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power," this is speaking of Jesus, the world that we live in, the physical life that we inhabit, is reliant on God's continual allowal of it to exist. We're reliant on God for salvation. We're dependent on him for salvation. This is one of the most obvious things that we're dependent on him for. Romans 5 and 6 says, "For when we were yet without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly." We need him to be saved. We're dependent on him even for being good, for finding righteousness, for finding morality. That is through God. In Matthew 19 and verse 17, it says, "And he said unto him, Why callest thou me good? There is none good, but one, that is God." We're imperfect people. We make mistakes all the time, both spiritual mistakes that involve us sinning and mistakes that have nothing to do with righteousness. And to give you just an inconsequential example, I'll give you an example. I love playing basketball, and shooting basketball is almost entirely about your form and about the strength you put into a shot, depending on where you are on the floor. And I can feel like I do the exact same thing every single time, and I put the exact same strength into a shot from the exact same spot on the floor, and I get a different result almost every single time. Albeit I'm not a great basketball player. But even if you look at some of the great shooters of all time, like Stephen Curry, who set records with things like 90, 50, 40 averages, which is 90% from the free throw line, 50% from the floor, and 40% from three, those are not super high averages. 40% from three is considered amazing, and you are missing it more than half of the time. And that's just something as inconsequential as shooting a basketball. Human beings make mistakes every day for all of our lives, whether big or small. And we gather here, and we gather around the table, and we remember the sacrifice that Christ made because we're imperfect, because we make mistakes, because we sin and we fail, and we broke our relationship with God. And without Jesus, we wouldn't have an ability to make that relationship right. And when we reflect on that, it should bring us great humility. It should bring us great humility. And last is positivity. And this is probably the most obvious of the three byproducts of joy. You might actually say it's the primary byproduct, and we'll talk about it more in just a minute. But joy does not mean that you can't be sad or upset. The word itself means cheerfulness or delight, and that's true. But that doesn't mean that we can never feel sorrow or that we're never going to be annoyed by something or angry about something. But it does mean that deep down we're not left in misery without hope. It means that we are joyful, that we are positive people, that we can see the silver lining in things. And the way we obtain that links back to the very first part of this lesson, that we study for it, we look for it. It comes from study and reflection on God's word, and it's how all of this begins. We read of the promises that God has given to his people for hundreds and thousands of years, and we see that he has never failed to come through on those promises. It gives us sight beyond what we would normally have, because this life is not all that we have to look forward to. Instead, we have a Savior who died and rose again to deliver us. We have a God who loved us so much that he gave up his Son for us, and we have a home prepared where sorrow won't ever touch us again. I think Paul explains this perfectly in Romans 8 and verse 18. He says, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." And what Paul is talking about here is perspective. I'll give you another example. When I go into work on Monday and things are incredibly busy and everything that could go wrong does go wrong, it makes me want to not go back to work the next day. It makes me want to call in. But if that same thing happens on Friday, I find it a whole lot easier to bear, because I know that in 8 hours I'll get to go home and I'll get to rest from my work, at least for a time. Now, our perspective should no longer be limited to the pains and the sufferings and the sorrow of this world. Instead, it should be focused on the eternal glory and the peace that we have in the home that is to come. And, I work with somebody who is just incredibly positive. He's a very positive person. Every morning it used to be at 6:45, but at 7 a.m. now, they moved our shifts around. At the end of our meetings, he claps and he says, "Let's go, team." And he doesn't say it in a sarcastic way. He is genuine about his excitedness to be there. And I find that very encouraging. And I've heard people ask him why he's so happy, why he's so positive. And he quotes this verse every single time. He says, "This is the day which the Lord hath made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." It's a good attitude to have, and it's encouraging to me. It helps give me focus. And sometimes I forget just how impactful my attitude can be on other people. Your attitude is one of the most impactful things that you can display. Matthew 5:16, Jesus tells us, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." And your attitude is one of the most influential things that you can have. It's one of the most influential ways that you can shine as a light to the dark world, because it's an everyday thing. You can show people day in and day out that you have hope, that you have joy, that you have a good attitude because of the promises of God, because of the things God has given you. And finally, before we close, I want to dig in a little deeper on something that I mentioned earlier, something I started out with when we were talking about positivity. Being joyful does not take away the sting of sorrow or of loss, and it doesn't mean we can't be afflicted with those pains. One of the lowest points in David's life occurred when his son Absalom rises against him in rebellion and is killed in battle. And David had taken great care to make sure that his son would be protected even during this battle. He told all of his generals, he told all the people that were in charge, "If you see him, treat him gently. Don't hurt him." But one of David's captains, Joab, he doesn't think that's a good advice. He thinks that this guy's a problem, and so he kills him. He sees him and he kills him. And we see David's response in 2 Samuel 18, verse 33. It says, "And the king was much moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, 'O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee. O Absalom, my son, my son.'" David's heart is clearly broken here. And this is not the only instance that we see him dealing with sorrow. In Psalm 6 and verse 6, he says, "I am weary with my groaning. All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears. Mine eye is consumed because of grief. It waxeth old because of all mine enemies." You read throughout the Psalms that many times David deals with grief. David deals with pain. David deals with loss and sorrow. And David is not alone in this. We also see the same thing from Jesus. When Lazarus dies, Jesus goes to his sisters, Mary and Martha. And when they come to the tomb, Jesus weeps over that tomb. He weeps at the death of his friend. And finally, when Jesus is on the cross, there's a moment where he is experiencing the weight of sin and the withdrawal of God's presence. And he cries out in Matthew 27 and verse 46. And it says, "And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani." That is to say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" There are going to be times in our lives where we're sad. There are going to be times in our life where we ought to be sad. You can lose a brother or sister to old age or to accident, somebody that you love. And, if that person is a Christian, we rejoice that they're going home and that they're going to be with the Father. But we still feel the absence of them. We still mourn over them. We hurt over them. And Paul writes that we ought to be there for each other in those times, not that we just simply shouldn't have them. In Romans 12 and verse 15, it says, "Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep." There's a time and a place for sorrow, and it's okay to grieve, and it's okay to hurt, because emotional pain is just as real and can be just as debilitating as physical pain. It can take us just as long for us to heal from emotional pain. People break a leg or they break an arm, and it can take months for that thing to heal. We can treat grief that same way, that it's going to take time for us to heal, and it's going to take reliance on God for us. In order to heal, we need to embrace the fact that we feel those things, and we need to lean on our brothers and sisters, and ultimately, we need to look to God, because as we've talked about, even in the midst of sorrow, and even in the midst of pain, we can have joy. In fact, true God-given joy is certain to endure through the trials that we face in this life. And And that's the joy that Jesus was talking about when he said that my joy might remain in you and that your joy might be full. It's not a shallow happiness that comes and goes depending on what you're going through in your life. It's something that's deep, and it's something that's lasting, and it's something that only comes from God. So when we leave here and we go back out into a world that can be hard and that can be draining, that can be difficult, remember where your joy comes from. It doesn't come from things going right. It doesn't come from when everything works out. It comes from being rooted in God, in who he is, what he's promised, and what he's already done through us, done for us through Christ. I pray that the lesson this morning was uplifting to you, that you can look to this joy as you go out and you face difficult things in your life, that you are closer to God and you are reliant on him. If you have a need of the church, we want to pray for you. We want to be there for you. So we ask that you would come sit on this front pew as we stand and as we